Everybody, today July 28th, 2018, 1998, 2018. We are here in Tokyo. Only in Tokyo. Takashi-san is not joining us today. ちょっと寂しいですが、let's have a good Saturday afternoon session with the three of us. Later on, we will be joined by Ohashi. So what have we been doing? We have been looking at European culture, history, and today we have a look at Western philosophy. So we have had a look at Confucianism. Today we are going to discuss Western philosophy and make parallels with Confucianism, based on Uno-san's book that he wrote about Confucianism. We are trying to make some parallels and note the differences between the two. Hopefully that will help us to better understand the roots and the way of thinking that exists in Japan and Europe. So what does philosophy mean? Literally, it means the love of wisdom. It is actually very closely related to liberal arts. It studies. It has its roots and studies almost everything. It includes math, poetry, biology, physics, political science, astronomy. And in Western philosophy, it tries to answer the big questions, metaphysical questions, the fundamental nature of the world. Is there a God? Do we have a soul? Will we live after we die? The nature of an art of knowledge. Is what I see, does that really exist? So, for example, is what we are observing real? We had a look at Plato's Prisoners, and which actually says that what we observe merely shadows on the wall. So the reality could be different. It is not sure that what I am observing through my eyes is exactly the same as what Kimoto is observing through his eyes. But the only thing that we have in common is definition. So what is real? What exists? What doesn't exist? So that's another element of Western philosophy. And then finally we have the value theory, and that comes close to Confucian philosophy. How should we live? What rules should we follow? Which road should we take in order to become enlightened people? And one thing that is very typical for Western philosophy is that it always, whether it's metaphysics, epistemology, or value theory, is that it follows logic, reasoning, giving arguments, argumentation, and usually it follows basically by following logical deduction or induction, we arrive at a conclusion. So this is something that also is very important in Western philosophy. Logic, the following of logic. If there's one thing that you need to remember about Western society is that if a Western person generally doesn't want to be inconsistent or illogical, if you can trap a Western person in illogical. Gee, Uno-san. 食べられる? That looks so karai.
Very dangerous. Dangerous. You cannot eat it. No, you cannot. Maybe European people couldn't eat. I can eat, but...
But eat is one thing, but then to go to toilet, how's that?
No problem for me.
Really? Mm. Can I try that? One piece?
I don't. You had better not.
No?
No. Too risky. You can eat just pistachio. Yeah. That's okay.
辛いやつは。まあ。Alright, so logical reason, deduction, induction, following clear logic is very important, and I think that this is a big difference with Japanese way of thinking, which is well, I think there are parallel truths in Japan. That this is not really. Kimoto-san is.
He's Chinese.
Do?
Good.
Yeah?
Good.
I want to try one.
No problem.
I want to try one. もうすごい。
はい。Very hot, but I could eat. Start.
Surprisingly, not so hot. Not so hot.
Not so hot, yeah.
Not so hot. How come it's not so hot? Maybe because it's dry? Okay.
Una-san, why you bought it? To get a diet?
Diet?
No, I like it.
I like it. Where did you order it? Directly from? Oh.
But this is made in China, but the price is 3 times higher than asking to buy in China. 1,000.
It's your fault, Kimoto-san. Unu-san needs to spend money. Okay. So, going down into Western philosophy, we had a look at Pythagoras, and Pythagoras was one of the pre-Socratic philosophers. Pre-Socratic, Socrates was a major milestone in Western philosophy.
Oh, last week's short video?
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So Pythagoras was basically questioning everything, but he strongly believed that the truth was to be found in mathematics. Yeah. So that the mathematics could describe everything, from music to everything, like the way that the planets work, that the world works. But he also had he philosophized about so where do we come from? Is the soul part of us, like physically part of us, or is it transcendent? Does the soul continue to live or not? Is there such a thing as maybe reincarnation or moving the soul from one vehicle to the next? And he believed that the last to be true. That basically by being a good person, you could finally escape your vehicle and live forever, so independent of your vehicle. So that was basically Earth, and I think that has parallels in Buddhism. So Pythagoras was a very interesting character. He was a kind of a cult leader. What makes him actually pre-Socratic is that he had a lot of followers, and a lot of people believed in Pythagoras, and there were things in Pythagoras that he could not explain throughout his theory. What Socrates introduced was the Socratic questioning and following logic and basically trying to falsify.
Socrates' question is dialogue?
Dialogue, yes. Yeah. So dialogue. So critical questioning, trying to expose and finding a truth through Socratic questioning. So the pre-Socratic, so what was also in the video that we saw was that because of very inconvenient truths that they found, for example, the square root of 2 was not was not a logical number. Therefore, it kind of like made them embarrassed, and the people who pointed it out apparently had been drowned at the time. So that is that makes it pre-Socratic. It was not so much truth finding, but more kind of projecting the reality and for other people to accept, like a religion. Since Socrates, it was definitely not religious. It was more trying to find the truth, which put philosophy sometimes also at odds with the church, because not everybody would conclude that there exists a God. Many people did, because of the power of the church, and it was very unhealthy, very bad for your health to question the existence of God, for example. Only much later Nietzsche declared God to be dead, but there was no room for that in the Middle Ages. Basically, God, the existence of God was a given. But at least since Socrates, there was this. There was this search for the truth. So last week we looked at Socrates, we looked at Plato, and today I want to continue and look at Aristotle. Aristotle was a student of Plato. He was one of the big, the great, let's say the big three philosophers, and he was the teacher of Alexander the Great. He was a tutor of Alexander the Great. So let's have a look at Aristotle. So this is basically rhetoric, the fact that the world is not purely logical. This was something that Plato did not accept, but Aristotle basically, through observation, by looking at how people respond to debate, to politicians, is not only based on pure logical argumentation. Actually, usually that's only a minor part of it. There is the art of rhetoric. So, how to grab somebody's attention, how to be favorable. So, we can see that everywhere. Like politicians local politicians in Japan, they usually have good hair, and or they are attractive people.
You say superficial?
Superficial. Or somebody who was being admired because he was a great person, completely unrelated to his argumentation. So it was a famous soccer player or famous athlete or a TV personality or something like that. That is why people actually are persuaded by this person's argumentation, not by the contents, but who this person is. Aristotle recognizes this and says, logic by itself is not sufficient to actually win an argument. So if you want to win an argument, you need to actually focus on people's motivations, what drives people, their fears, their anxieties, their pride, their desire to have fun, basically everything that if you want to persuade people, you have to do more than just be logical. You have to...
you don't have to be logical.
Of course, like if your argument is completely... Well, you don't have to be logical to win an election or to get people to vote for you. If you are lucky enough to be an attractive person or a famous person or a admired athlete or something like that, you could actually win an argument, something that's completely unrelated to the contents of your argumentation. So if you want to be a persuasive person, you cannot ignore the fact that you need to also address these things. So you need to really directly address the people and not only stand on logic, but also acknowledge the fact that you need to tap into people's fears and to all these secondary things that drives people. People are not necessarily logical creatures.
I remember I viewed this video before, and at that time, Greece, they also discuss about how to debate, how to persuade people is not only content,
right,
but also much more important method how to persuade people, right?
Vocal variety. Body language.
I remember.
It's absolutely that's very important. It's they try to do scientific study about why people are persuaded by others, and it's found that only up to about 30% of persuasiveness is determined by the content of your argument. 70% is determined by other factors like delivery. So how you deliver a message.
Exactly. Not content.
Right.
It's amazing. 2,500 years ago, they did kind of sort of remark.
Right. This is today still. I go and visit Toastmasters every other week, and we practice.
Oh, you have every other week?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
Well, I'm currently one of the
Leader?
directors. Yeah.
Oh my God.
So that's but it's very important, something that you cannot ignore. So if you want to be influential, you also need to recognize that who you're dealing with and find the right voice and the right way to.
Yeah, exactly. Whenever I go to make a
message.
presentation, a speech, and I need to prepare before speech, I need to prepare for how many days? Couple of days or 3 days for preparation for not contest, for my attitude,
Right.
emotional attitude, right?
Of attitude and
Consider for my health,
Right.
not take a cold, sort of kind of things, my care of that. Yeah, that's right.
So he actually was. If you put all these things together, like the theory of happiness, about the being moderate between virtues between vices, and finding a good balance, the theory about the arts and the role of the arts, about friendship and rhetoric and debate. So he was very much very prolific, and a lot of his theories are still standing today. Still very influential.
Okay, my definition, democracy definition, successful democracy, is like many people say, do you have election? Do you have free press? Freedom of expression? I don't think so. This is people living there. Are they happy or not? They're happy is the best way to evaluate that country.
So, but because I was wondering about this. So you have a series about what was it? Democracy in which country are you currently studying? Oh, Saudi Arabian democracy. There is no such thing as democracy in Saudi Arabia, but there could be.
No democracy, but Saudi Arabia is evaluated an aspect of democracy.
Right. So measured against democracy. So
no democracy.
Okay. So basically, what you're doing is you're setting a standard for what a good democracy is, and then compare Saudi Arabia against those
people living there. Are they happy? Saudi Arabia, men may be happy, women not happy.
Well, men who are Salafite.
Men is happy.
Right, but you also need to be on the right side of the king and a Shia, not a Sunni.
They are Sunni.
Yeah.
Sunni Wahabi. It's very strict religious people. No liquor and very clean life.
Right.
No nightclub.
Right.
But still very strict law. But they're happy, but not women.
And police officers are very happy because they all drive Lamborghinis. Eh?
Well, there's still these people now there.
Right. Still, but I don't know how long it will last because.
No, they don't. Their wealthy will not sustain forever. Not now. Right?
Lots of money, but never managed to grow out of this their roots. So Aristotle, I think, is a philosopher that comes maybe closest to Confucius.
How to measure happiness?
Right. How to live your life.
But Confucius said this is not the fundamental of happiness.
Oh.
different.
Ma,
But Confucius also said this golden mean is very effective for how to live. Okay? How to live. You don't get lots of money. You don't chase it for the position,
right.
fame, and so forth.
They're almost contemporaries, right? Maybe Aristotle is a bit younger than Confucius. Confucius is 1500,
almost the same.
500 BC.
Yeah.
But this
same.
is 400 BC.
Almost same.
Aristotle, almost the same. So I think this is a kind of relatively easy to understand philosopher.
Oh, wait a minute. Aristotle is he written many books. I read some of those for writing Democracy.
Oh, I see.
And I agree with you. He's easy, but he wrote lots of books.
Right. But I don't think he written them himself. So he was the founder of the Lyceum. Actually, Lyceums we have everywhere in Europe. I graduated from a Lyceum. So
What?
a Lyceum. So you have the Plato.
What is Lyceum?
Lyceum is a school, basically. Officially, Aristotle didn't want to teach inside classrooms, so he would just walk around and teach as they were going around. It's different from the academia. That was from
How many
Plato.
students did he have?
I don't know actually how many
1,000,
students.
2,000?
No, not that many.
Like, do you know in China, or even in Japan, they have, Japan is not like all the years, but more closer at the 8th era, but they have thousand students they have. In China, same.
Really?
Yeah, in China, thousand students they have. I don't, because at that time they don't have TV, they have no amusement activity. Greece they have, they are Parthenon.
Right.
Right? But still they have, they are looking for some intellectual event.
Right.
School.
Right. But he was more or less like he taught, worked together with Plato a little bit. Then they separated their ways. He started his own school. Then he went off to. No, first he went to Macedonia and taught Alexander the Great. Then he came back and then he founded the Lyceum.
Yes, Alexander the Great in Macedonia, right.
So, but it's amazing that somebody, like a philosopher who could actually basically write a manual on how to write a novel, so to write a meta-novel, but also write of the rules of how to persuade people. Really a person of very high intellectual capacity.
Yeah, that's right.
So this is one of my favorite philosophers.
This is very kind of Confucius and Aristotle, and at the same time is one more. Aristotle and Greece
Socrates.
philosopher. Yeah, Greece philosopher.
Yeah,
and,
so Socrates, Plato.
Confucius era, and 2,500 years ago they have more. What else? We're not Buddhist yet. Before Christianity, they had a book. Testament. Old Testament.
Old Testament. Yeah.
Old Testament is like before 500 years
Right.
before Christ.
Right.
Old Testament.
Right.
Old Testament and Greece and China. Or more. 3. 2,500 years ago, in the world, lots of sort of new emerging thought,
Right.
invention type happened at that time, right?
But the Old Testament was very much widespread. It did not only originate from So it had stories from everywhere, Babylon and Israel, and so it came from everywhere. If you read that right now, you look at history, it describes all kinds of events that happened in Greece, in the Middle East. It collects all.
By the way, did you study the Testament before?
I had to. It's part of education. Yeah.
You did.
Yeah. So I read. Well, I read. That's a lot, but I had to go to church when I was a kid until I was 12 years old. Well, I think 12 years old or something like that. Maybe a bit older. I had to go to church every weekend. So in church, we read passages from the Bible. In school, we would have biblical education. So you're being exposed to passages of the Bible. And, so that's, maybe that didn't really taught me to be a religious person, but it kind of gives you awareness of culture and the roots of Western culture, because, well, religion plays a very important role in our society, even though we are not so religious anymore. But still, even though Protestantism is not so widespread, people do not really adhere to being a Protestant or a Catholic, but it defines the roots of our culture. So I think that we are still very much Protestant, even though we're not religious anymore. It's the cultural values that and the ethical standards that still very much exist within Dutch society.
Right. I know that.
So that's why it's important to actually study that and learn about it, even though you may not be a religious person. So in that sense, I'm kind of grateful that my parents forced me to go to church.
My not youngest, second youngest boy, he's Christian, and he studied a lot. Yeah, he's studying a lot every Sunday.
So and sometimes I also needed to go to church. Like on Wednesdays, we had every Wednesday afternoon we had a day of study. Yeah. But not memorizing text or something. But more not memorizing, but more studying ethical. Well, talking about ethical dilemmas and taking a piece, like a little piece of the Bible, reading it together and talking about it. But nothing compared to the sincere, the diligence and the dedication that young people, for example, in Islamic countries have when they are memorizing the Quran. It's not like that at all.
Quran memorized. So Islamist children is very well educated for morality. Because they force them to memorize Quran. So more than Christianity.
So one of the things that I like about Aristotle is that he's logical, but he also acknowledges the importance of illogical elements in people's decision-making process and in what they actually end up doing. A lot of the other philosophers that we will see will completely, more or less, like abstract from that, and are really very rigorous into truth finding and really finding the essence of things. Whereas Aristotle, relative to other philosophers, it takes a much more holistic approach. Like Camus, Descartes, etc. They are very much into basically finding truth through abstract reasoning.
You mean holistic means supernatural kind of thing?
So more no, actually it takes a more inclusive, like observing through observation and trying to find logical, that more of through empiric observation and trying to, okay, why are things working? Why do people make decisions? And why, if we see so much art around this, what is the function of art? Whereas others were thinking, okay, do I exist or does God exist? And they find answers to that question not through observation in the world, but by pure logical argumentation.
Philosophical attitude.
Right.
Why
So,
you exist.
but they're both philosophers, but take a different approach. So one philosopher, one stream in philosophy was looking at the world and tried to describe what they observed, and the other stream of philosophy was very strict in just finding absolute truths and answers to big questions, but through reasoning.
By the way, at that time, do they have kind of flow, or do they have kind of what to say, just sort of absolute nothingness kind of approach they have?
So
it means just
like
observe,
Zen
observe trees and observe everything, and they try to figure out some sort of
truth in that.
truth.
Yeah. Well, I think Plato comes much closer to that kind of attitude than Aristotle. Plato was more, okay, what is real? So through observation, try to find, okay, what is the
just watching for trees, and then we try to figure out the nature of things.
Oh.
Nature of things, right? Then this is for
as a metaphor for the nature of things, or
everything. Like okay, one example: you are watching moon,
right?
And you are watching moon. Okay, this is so fantastic. You're going to look at moon.
Right.
You forget the time goes by.
Right.
This is it.
Right.
Absolutely.
But also, like if we look at Nishida, as you're talking about, right? The moon. So moon and Nishida. So I read that. So I also understand that Nishida asked the question: does the moon exist? Do I exist? And basically, the conclusion of Nishida, what I understand, is that the moon exists through me. So without me, the moon does not exist. So basically, I would almost say that in Nishida's philosophy, I am God, compared with Western philosophy. So I am God. So the beautiful moon exists only through me. So you need to observe all these things, and if you don't observe, if you don't look around you, if you're not one with the world around you, then the beautiful world doesn't exist. So it's up to you to look, observe, and therefore it becomes reality, right? But these are the same questions that Plato asked himself. So what do we observe? Is that moon real, or is it not real? So I think that there is a big parallel between Nishida and Plato, but not so much with Aristotle. Was what I thought, but I'm not a philosopher. So definitely parallels. But I think that Nishida was very different from Confucius.
No, he's Buddhist. He's influenced by Buddhists, not the Confucius.
Right. So I was actually wondering why you put Nishida in your book, because Nishida was so much.
Absolute nothingness is very similar to Confucianism.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, I didn't understand that.
Very similar to Confucianism. So I just put it Buddhist. Zen. He's based on Zen.
Right. Buddhism.
Confucianism is just you need to constantly focus on the trees, whatever, and just observe it, and then finally you got something nature of things. This is the same as Nishida.
Oh.
Nature of he got reaching to the nature of things. Nature. This is the Confucianism.
Okay.
Ishida is the same. So Buddha is the same, Zen and Confucianism are the same. So that's the reason my question is, okay, this is Greece, at that time philosopher is the same. They should be same. Because 2,500 years ago, they have no some chemical or physics or any kind of mathematics. And they just
mathematics definitely they had.
Yeah, but simple, okay.
Yeah.
But at that time, they had a lot of time to spend on who you are, okay. What is human being?
Right.
Why you exist?
Right.
Sort of things they can spend a lot of time to think.
So, and therefore there is a person like Plato.
Like this year, we have a lot of things to doing, many things. So they forget the nature of things. Ancient people. So we need to study back to ancient people so that this is very important to get the nature.
Right.
Right? Very important. But the recent people, they lost it. Japanese people, that's the reason I just talking about. Japanese people, they don't have the spirit of Japan. They lost it.
So what you're saying is that basically the spirit of Japan is the essence of being Japanese.
Yeah. So my simple question, identity, who are you? Okay, just do you have dignity or do you have pride? Right? So what is your existence? What is your nature? Right? This is very important. Who are you? They lost since Meiji Restoration, and they lost after World War II. Everything gone. Just they're busy for knowledge or just entertainment, or how to live, how to get money.
So superficial.
Superficial, not good. So this is it. This is one of those. This is just these issues we are discussing now.
So philosophy is an excellent way to take away to get deeper into the essence of things. Okay, who am I? But also, okay, what I think if you look at it, then really focusing on the essence is Plato. But Aristotle is basically more around that core issue. Like, okay, he realized that things exist, but in reality, there are things around the core essence, and people actually, they are not always logical. They're not always prepared to do the soul searching. That's also one of the reasons why, for example, Plato argues that countries should be led, or a city or wherever, the people who should rule other people are the philosophers, because they care to find the truth, and other people, non-philosophers, are not so much are not focused on the truth, but are irrational. They like to abstract from the essence and be more comfortable at the surface, look at simple beauty or direct benefit without taking the truth into consideration. So they come up with illogical steps and illogical policies, simply because they don't care to look to find the truth. So therefore, Plato argued Greece is always a model for democracy. Well, it was actually Plato didn't feel that people are similar. Therefore, it was not a democracy as we know today. It was just democracy for the philosophers and nobody else.
Why I'm writing book for democracy? Why I'm concerned about the Greece philosophers? Because recent people never thinking about those issues. So it is very big, things. They forget it. Very, because all people they studied Confucianism. All people studied all the Greece philosophers. thinking about lots of things, but everywhere they forget it.
Right.
Gone.
Right.
But
But that's like you say you always talk about Japanese education, but I think globally education has moved that way. I mean, education in that era was very much just like in China, becoming a good person. It was the same in Greece, looking at the finding fundamental issues, not being practical, not about making money. That was not an issue at all. It was much more about liberal arts, how to finding the essence, finding the core value of yourself, and then developing yourself into a good human being. That kind of education has been replaced, especially I think since the industrial area in Europe as well, where education has become a vehicle to actually produce productive people who can benefit to the factories and be good workers and actually help the industrialists to make money. That's the nature of education. So less and less focus on the essence of things and more on practical skills that serve the purpose of actually, for example, become an accountant. That's the skill that you have, but an accountant doesn't necessarily think about the essence of things. It's not necessary because we give them television, we give them consumerism, and they will be able to go through life being productive, helping us to gain material wealth, but completely forgetting about the essence of things. And in that respect, I don't think that Japan or Europe are that much different.
Not much different.
No, I think that what you're observing in Japan since the Meiji era is something that happened in Europe since
By
the
the way,
Industrial
are they studying?
Revolution.
Are they studying liberal arts?
In Europe?
Yeah.
Well, it
Japanese,
depends.
no.
It depends. It's not everybody. So basically, the depends on
You know, I'm writing book. All those books is liberal arts. So I'm planning for using these books for graduate school in future. I'm serious of book writing down. So because this is not practical book. Okay, this is not practical book, but this is most useful book.
It will not help you to make more money.
That's right. But recently, not young and old, everybody, they are not studying all those areas. That causes Japanese people, they are losing dignity and pride.
Right.
Okay? Dignity and pride. Why they don't have dignity? Because they forget tradition. What the tradition is like this.
Right.
All the people thought, all the people studying.
Right.
Confucian.
Yeah, but I mean, nobody has time for that because now we have television, we have office hours, we have consumerism. So that's nobody really cares to do about this because it doesn't make money, and money has become the golden standard to which we measure people.
Recent people they are starting to recognize TV program is nothing. Right? Major of content is nothing. Some is very valuable, but the majority of the content nothing, right?
Nothing, right.
And they are shifting to the TV, to the SNS, or YouTube, or some other area.
But anyways, anything that is quick consumable and
but still they are not reaching to the true liberal arts, true content to study yet. But I don't know how to encourage them to study. What? But this is very important. Everybody forget it. And also, almost all people, they forget to read Inazo Nitobe.
Right. And actually, if you come to think of it, this kind of knowledge, this kind of essence has become so scarce that it actually will become so valuable because nobody teaches it. Studies it anymore.
Nobody teaches.
So people nowadays, you think, okay, I'm studying to become an accountant. Now there are very few people who become an accountant because their dream when they were 7 years old was to become an accountant. You become accountant because of You want to secure your future, have a job, and make money. But that doesn't make you a leader in any respect. So if you want to be a leader, if you want to be a follower, then if you want to get followers, you need to have intrinsic values. But because without followers, you cannot be a good leader, right? So basically, you need to have some intrinsic value. Nowadays, still, I mean, you need Aristotle to actually know how to persuade people. The art of rhetoric, the art of persuasiveness, the understanding that people are not perfect. You can learn this most effectively by studying liberal arts and having a good understanding of the basic nature of human beings.
Right. Right.
That's why I like this assignment so much. Okay, so we continue?
Are you going to show another video too?
Yes, actually.
Lots of video.
Lots of video. Yeah, there's a lot of good videos. There's a lot of text, but it takes a long time to actually write everything out. And I think through videos, it's easier to understand, to look at it in the context. I saw these videos and
after one video, falling asleep anyway. Good afternoon.
Okay, so this video is interesting. Actually, it compares the big three. It compares Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle and how they measure up against each other.
That's easy.
No, if you want to skip this one, it's also fine.
No, you don't need to skip.
Okay, because we also have the art of logic. So when we look at I think this is very fundamental when you're dealing with Europeans. Deduction, induction, abduction, the way that they work and the way that we apply them to win arguments, I think are interesting. But okay, so if you fall asleep on us, and I will stop the video, and we'll go.
No, it's okay.
Okay.
Let's continue.
If you write anything on your computer, you need to get.
3, 2,
I write
1.
pretty much.
Alright, so basically Plato compared to Aristotle, basically they have the origins in Socrates and the Socratic questioning. And Socratic questioning meaning to negate a hypothesis, so asking questions to test your hypothesis against, and growing or getting closer to the truth by actually falsifying your hypotheses was the way that Socrates tried to get closer to the truth. Plato's student, Socrates' student was Plato, and Aristotle in turn was a student of Plato. Plato very much looked at the world with and tried to fit it into a geometrical ideal, the ideal form and shape and everything that was and exists around us, that the planets, they all had the ideal shape, even the universe had an ideal.
Okay.
Daijoubu?
My master is.
Oh. Did you fall?
Windows.
My master is tensed. Go ahead.
Okay. Wow.
Not hard. My
No.
master.
Record it?
So actually your heart is in the other side.
Edison, which is a big impact to the which person gives a big impact to the Westerners? Plato and Aristotle. I think Aristotle is a big impact to the European people.
Right. I think that's I think that actually they both have a big influence. Yeah. No. It's really. I think it's really true.
Ohai-san,
How to share?
Konnichiwa.
How to share?
あ、こんにちは。
oh, wait a second. I'm going to pomp,
Oh, yeah.
pomp.
Your room?
Yeah, that's it. This is. Okay, share.
Are you in the office or are you at home?
Not at home.
I'm at a kind of a home office.
Home office.
Ah. So you have a whiteboard at home?
Yes.
Yeah, me too.
I'm outside, so I'll turn off my camera.
Ah. Okay. So I think we need to wait a minute. So we make this more and we're going. Okay. All right. Ohai-san, to give you a very, very, very quick summary. So we have been talking about European culture, looked at European history. Then we looked at Confucianism and Zen Buddhism.
Okay.
And today we are looking at Western philosophy and trying to make a parallel between Western philosophy and Confucianism, respectively Zen Buddhism. So far we have looked at the pre-Socratic philosophers, mainly to Pythagoras. We had a look at Socrates, Plato and Aristotle, and we are currently discussing how Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates measure against each other. So what is their main difference, and what drives them? So, shall we continue where we were at?
No, you just explained the last video more.
Oh, but oh, I didn't see it. Okay, so basically, why do we have Socrates was basically a mark stone. It's basically the year zero in philosophy. So we have the AC BC was basically like started with Socrates, and Socrates lived almost was a contemporary of Confucius. Around 500 BC. So Eastern philosophy and Western philosophy were kind of like coexistent, and rose at the same time.
Without knowing each other.
Without knowing each other, without really being exposed to each other. I think Eastern philosophy and Confucianism is more or less a finding, basically describes the road how to become a good person, whereas Western philosophy is more characterized by finding the truth, metaphysical truth, and also finding the essence of things. Is what I see, does it really exist? As well as ethics. So how should we organize the state? Ethical questions. But what is really rigorously different is the role of logics. Logics is being applied, especially since Socrates, to measure your hypothesis against. Falsification of your hypothesis is a way to getting closer to the truth. And so prior to Socrates, for example, Pythagoras, he tried to describe the world in perfect geometry and mathematics, and he found a lot of relationship between, for example, mathematics and music and other elements. So there are mathematical constants, and that showed how the world would fit perfectly together. Socrates, on the other hand, he basically took pride into the fact that he knew nothing. He was just interested in finding the truth, and he did that by asking questions and asking difficult questions to find the truth. And the truth is not always nice,
and this actually caused Socrates to be sentenced to death because he was antagonizing the youth of Athens and making them ask all kinds of difficult questions that the elite could not answer to. So he was, but he was calm, and he said, "Well, it's just a matter of finding the truth." He didn't really regret it, but he took a very big influence. He had a very big influence on his student Plato, who actually wrote his books as conversations that he had with Socrates. Socrates was always the leading figure, and according to Plato, the most intelligent human being that ever existed. Plato had the vision of the world as being a perfect geometric ideal, just like Pythagoras, basically. He said, okay, well, there's this perfect symmetrical figures that build up the entire universe around us. Squares.
Right?
Sorry?
That's Pythagoras you're talking about.
Can you repeat that? Sorry.
That's Pythagoras you're talking about.
Yeah, but talking about Pythagoras, but Plato followed in the footsteps of Pythagoras.
Okay.
So he also believed in perfect shapes and geometry. He was more of an abstract thinker, not trying to find the truth through observation, but more or less of a exercise in the mind. So through deduction and abstraction, try to create a reality, description of the reality. And one of the things that we looked at last week was that actually Plato was struggling very much about, okay, what is reality? And he described the way that most people see reality as prisoners who were born in a cave and never saw the world other than the shadows on the wall. So to them, the world was, the reality was shadows, because they never saw anything other than the shadows that they observed on the wall. So to show that what we think is reality is not necessarily true, because as we know, the world is different than just two-dimensional, black and white shadows on the wall, but it's a three-dimensional sphere. So the question about reality and these abstract things that are typical for Plato, whereas Aristotle is more into empirical observation. So how does the world really work? So what Aristotle observed, for example, on the market square when there was a debate going on, he saw that people who won the debate were not necessarily the people with the best arguments, but people who had other virtues in the eyes of the crowd. For example, they were handsome, or they were good athletes, or they had other virtues, and that meant that was not necessarily the result of the power of their argument. So one of the things that Aristotle did, he wrote in one of his books the how to be persuasive, and he wrote something that we today still use when we are writing speeches, for example, the importance of identifying people's primal fears and their pride and their objectives, and tapping into those, and the importance of vocal variety, body language, to actually become more persuasive. Plato hated this. He didn't accept the fact that people were irrational, and therefore he actually argued that we should not have democracy. Well, there should only be democracy for philosophers, because they know the essence of the world, the essence of existence, and therefore they are the only ones who are capable and able to rule in a responsible way. Therefore, he said, Plato said, we should let the world be ruled by philosophers. Aristotle said, okay, no, we just need to understand that people are not always logical. Plato was very much into the abstract thinking. Aristotle was more looking at, okay, what is actually what is the world is really like? What is the role of art? What is the role of happiness? How do we reach virtue? And finding the virtues versus the vices, and finding the path, the middle road to become a virtuous person is by avoiding to fall into the vices that were usually at either side of the virtues. So, for example, in conversation, you have the people who are bores, who do not have humor, who basically cannot inspire other people, and on the other hand, you have the buffoons who are funny without any restriction, but at the expense of others, and not considerate. So the virtue in the middle is to be witty, to not be boorish, to not be a buffoon, but to be witty and considerate. So he identified 11 virtues, and if you would follow those virtues, you become a virtuous person. So virtuous person, yeah.
Okay.
So basically, Plato, Aristotle, and Socrates form the foundation of Western philosophy. They're very often attributed for the inventors of democracy, but that was not exactly the democracy as we know it today. We were actually talking about the role and the essence of philosophy in today's world before you called in, and Uno-san was talking about, okay, well, actually today we do not think about these things anymore. In Confucianism, there is this importance of education, of finding reality, of finding the nature of things, and through studying, and that education in Japan is no longer aimed at finding these virtues and making people become virtuous people, but more focused on developing skills to make money. But that is actually the same is true, I think, in Western world since the Industrial Revolution. We are also in our educational system, we are also being prepared to become productive workers, to develop skills that are necessary to run companies, management, accounting, engineering. These skills typically will help us to make money, and there is very little attention towards philosophy to actually develop depth in your personality, which is then kind of like repaired through monetary remuneration, consumerism, television, and shallow entertainment. So I don't think that, in conclusion, I don't think that there is so much difference between Japan since the Meiji era and Europe since the Industrial Revolution.
Okay.
Okay, so shall we move on to the art of argumentation, of logic? I think this is the basis.
May I make a comment?
Yes. Please.
The Industrial Revolution came before the Meiji era, obviously.
Right.
Right? So, what happened in Japan is after Edo period, and knowing that Japan has been had a closed market for too long, and the world outside of Japan has been much more advanced, and they're doing some colonizations, and Japan was aware that they need to catch up on certain things.
Right.
of Meiji era, one is to pick up all these things to that Japan was behind on, that's good stuff, and also at the same time go back to the spirit of Jimmu Emperor. And that was the original idea in starting of Meiji. But as you mentioned, what happened is the effect of Industrial Revolution of less virtue but skill was to make money. That was, I guess, also attractive as a human, I guess, to Japanese people. So I think that's where it wasn't the parallel start, but the Japanese impact I think was received by the actual Industrial Revolution started in Western world. That's my comment.
Right, exactly. I think it was more or less an attempt to catch up, to modernize Japan, because they measured themselves against the power of the Western nations and the wealth that they had, and the threat that they were under, because this economic power could also drive the military, and therefore was a threat to the autonomous nature of the Japanese, the country of Japan. So therefore, they needed to build up economic power, military power to actually maintain their identity. But in the process, actually, they compromised their identity by giving up on their original nature, because that was not how success was measured.
Right.
But it was kind of inevitable, perhaps, because if they wouldn't have done that, then they might have become under much more influence of Western nations, because of their expensive and expensive nature, and the way that they try to colonialize and dominate countries in order to be on their side, right? You're either for us or against us mentality. So that would have meant that Japan would have come under much more influence, and therefore maybe also would have the same thing would have happened. So maybe it was just unavoidable that this kind of Meiji era came into existence, because no matter what or how, Japan could no longer stay in isolation, and therefore maybe found the best way to become powerful on their own instead of under the influence of Western nations.
What you have mentioned is true. The issue was that towards the end of the Edo time, when Shogun was losing power, that was also the time when so much different Western countries are trying to open up a business with Japan.
Right.
But like back in the middle of Edo era, there were like maybe one or few for like long span of period. But towards the end of the Edo era, there were so many coming in and trying to kind of force to open up the trade with Japan.
Right.
And so in which then Japan had no option but to open up the trade, which then have to be prepared to not to be colonized, but to be prepared to keep up in the same level, so that won't be taken over, I guess.
Right. So no matter what, they had to open up.
Yes.
And therefore they chose the way to open up and still remain independent by becoming a stronger nation.
Yes.
Yeah. So I think that was actually the smartest way to go, given the circumstances.
I agree.
Okay. So let's have a look at argumentation and the way Western society always argues along the lines of deduction, induction, abduction. I think that's something that is important to realize as if you are engaging with Western cultures.
Let's suppose that you're writing a really important email to a colleague.
Well, it is difficult, but I think in general, so deduction, you have premises, and if you put two or more premises together, you can create a valid or invalid argument. The example that Mr. Green gave in this video is that all men are mortal, which is a valid premise, because all people die eventually. All men are mortal. Socrates is a man, which is also true. Therefore, Socrates is mortal. That's a valid deductive argument. So that follows out of the other. One follows out of the other. That so far so good, but two valid premises do not necessarily make a valid conclusion. So you can and we see this very often in reality. For example, if we have basically we see in economics we see this a lot. People create a model of what the world looks like, and then they actually start to go through empirical observation, and then they say, okay, well then there is a relation between A and B, therefore C. But always in economics, the argument is about the premises. The premises, whether they are right or wrong, because you need to abstract the world in order to capture it. The world is way too complicated to capture it entirely. Therefore, you need to make a model of the world. So the way that economists work is that they make an abstraction of the world. They say, okay, the people work like this, and very very often this is a caricature of how people really work. So, for example, in economics we have utility maximization. That is how people work. So based on that, but people are not necessarily rational beings, and they do not always see utility in the right perspective. We saw this in the way that Aristotle reasons and observed that people are not always rational beings. But in economic theory, humans are very often reasonable human beings. So this is where the premises actually have the flaw. This is why economics is such an ineffective science, because actually the premises are often at stake. Not the way that we deduce the mathematical problems. Once we have made the abstraction, we are very well capable of observing, collecting data, and processing data, and giving a conclusion, but the debate is always about the premises. So, in Western culture, deduction plays a very important role. The way that deduction plays an important role because if you can find illogical arguments, etc., or inconsistencies, or an abstraction that you can contest, then you can falsify the hypothesis and break the argument of a Western person. That is a way that you can win a debate, for example, because for some reason, Western people, intrinsically, culturally speaking, hate to be inconsistent. It doesn't. That you need to repair yourself, otherwise you're just wrong, right? I think in Japanese culture, what I observe is that there is no such thing as an absolute truth, or things can be true at the same time. It's not necessarily. There is more of a holistic approach towards the reality, and things can be in conflict with each other and can still be true. Parallel truth. Western person cannot live with that.
What do you mean parallel truth?
parallel truths. So, what I sometimes hear from Japanese person when I'm arguing something, I follow logical, for example, deduction. So this, then that, and therefore I'm right. I said, no, you're right, but you're wrong, right? So that's maybe my argumentation is right, but yet I'm not right because basically what the Japanese person is saying to me. So your logical reasoning might be so, but the way that you constructed your model, the way that you have actually constructed your premises might serve your conclusion, but there is I do not necessarily agree with your premises, and logical even though you're logically right, it doesn't mean that this is the reality, because you choose to construct your world according to this model. That is not necessarily the way that I work, because what I observe is, actually, well, I just feel that. I just sense that you're not right.
I think, therefore, for European people, this is not acceptable. For lightning, lightning has two aspects. One is physical goods.
Right.
The other is a wave. It's a dual standard.
Right.
It's not not acceptable for Westerners.
Right. So that's not exactly.
Yeah.
So always our debates focus on this kind of like truth finding method, and it's always discussion about premises, deduction.
Edson.
Hi. Yes.
I haven't understood your parallel example yet. Could you explain again?
The parallel example or the parallel truth?
Yes.
Right. So, quite often when I am trying to persuade a Japanese person, I follow my Western standard of reasoning, deduction. So I say, because of A and B, therefore C, right? Then the Japanese person says, okay, you're right, yet you're wrong. So in the Western world, people would say, okay, you're right, or you're wrong because, and then contest the premises, right? But
Very logical.
Very logical, purely logical. I think that if you want to persuade a Western person, then you will have to fight and counter the argumentation based on logical values.
Mm-hmm.
But in Western, in Japanese society, it's very more often okay. But we do not only have the logical deduction, and there's not a single path to describe the reality. There are parallel truths. There is more than one way of looking at the reality. So basically, I feel that in the Japanese mind, people are less prone to creating models, less prone to create premises, and trying to make a model out of that, and thereby trying to be persuasive. There is more of an observation and a way of looking at things from all kinds of different angles and direction, and thereby observing whether something is true or not. So there can be parallel truths, because what you can say, okay, this is obviously red, but if you look at it from the backside, it can be blue.
Right.
There
is expression in Japan about don't look at the one surface, but look at the mountain as a whole.
Right. So this is but for a Western person, it doesn't cut it. We want to make sense out of it.
I understand. I came from your view, then lived in Japan and have to learn the view of Japan. So I understand what you're saying.
Right.
Thank you.
Right. Okay, but it's very important to understand that you can make a Western person very uncomfortable by saying, well, okay, you're right, yet you're not. What do you mean?
You're right.
Right, so that actually, that is completely, that goes beyond, outside of the realm of how we were brought up, what our world looks like. And this is where there is a major gap, I feel, between Japanese culture and Western culture.
Yes, for example, in your example of your friends in parallel, I would try to bring up another example, another surface, but in same level. That would counter argue.
Right.
Then it would be insane. I would be able to expand the same surface, right?
Right. Well, I have to add to this that the person was not only Japanese but also a woman. Therefore, actually, even without trying to discriminate here, but therefore the value of logical argumentation completely goes out of the window.
To the emotional part.
Right.
Okay, I understand.
Right. So, yeah, I think that we are always trying to make sense out of the world. I saw you have a whiteboard behind you, and usually the reason why people use whiteboards is to create a model and to make sense out of things, right?
Yes.
Right. Exactly. That's why I use it too. So I also have a whiteboard in my home, and I use that to create a model. But I think that is a typical response of trying to make sense out of it, making the model to kind of grasp the essence and to see where you need to go from that. I think that it's a different approach than most Japanese people would take. They would just be more diligent into observing the world and looking at it from different angles and going around and around and by and finally coming to some kind of understanding, not by making a simplification, but through diligent observation and just asking yourself questions and questions and questions, and therefore getting a better understanding of how these things work.
Maybe the more communication gets to others and also to yourself. That would not be true.
Well, so if this is indeed true, then you can easily see why so many business negotiations and discussions are so difficult, because this is exactly the same as finding the truth, because you need to kind of understand what is the problem that we're facing. So if we are talking about a certain project, you need to visualize that project and kind of like get the essence out of that project, and a Western person would put it into a model and say, okay, well, this is the model, this is what we're going to do, this is the reality, and then we would go through that model step by step and agree on filling in the different elements of that model, and then once we've done that, we can basically negotiate the price, and then hence we got a deal. This is how two Western sides would negotiate a contract. But if you would do this between a Japanese side and a Western side, then the Western side, when they, for example, would make a model and a proposal, they would encounter the Japanese side asking all kinds of questions that may, from the perspective of the model, be completely irrelevant or minor and not focus on the main points. But this is the way that the Japanese side would try to find, okay, so what exactly are we talking about by taking the liberty of going around and not really focusing on the model at hand, but trying to find the actual, the real thing that you're going to build, not just the model and filling out the blanks and discriminating between main points and minor points. So coming to a mutual understanding of what you're going to do between a Western side and a Japanese side is extremely difficult, especially in a abstract construct, like, for example, a software development project or things like that are very difficult to grasp. And that's where cultural differences play a very important role. So to understand...
One more time, what was the example you just said? What kind of project?
A software development project, for example.
Software, okay. Sure.
Because it's very difficult to grasp, right? Because it's very difficult to make concrete and to understand and to completely get the idea and the model behind it, and to really understand, you have to. Well, usually the Western software, the Western side would create a model and try to make sense out of that, fill in the blanks. But if you have a more holistic approach, well, then you are really talking about a different reality.
Mm-hmm.
So if you don't really understand each other, it's very difficult to build a trust. If you put on top of that there is a difference in negotiation style, with delegated power for the negotiator on the one hand, on the Western side, and more of a back and forth between negotiator and headquarters on the other side, you can easily see that there is a big hurdle, between Western companies and Japanese companies to come to a mutual understanding and to broker deals. Mm-hmm. That could be one of the reasons why we see it's so hard for Japanese companies to be successful overseas, because of the way of thinking, the difference in thinking, and the difference of organizing your company. Put these two together, and you can easily see that it's a big hurdle to overcome. And
well,
that's
I think what you're saying is correct. The point of those global negotiators in Japan is I have to understand other countries' more culture and the way they do business, and have to be able to play two roles. To communicate with Japan side and be able to convince the Japanese organization side,
right,
in order to succeed, and also become a central communicator to the outside of Japan side to understand what the client wants.
Right. So yeah. that makes it very easy for negotiators who have to operate outside of Japan to become completely isolated in between two fires.
Yeah.
But they're not only they need to overcome not only the negotiation with their counterpart, their Western counterpart, but also with the Japanese headquarters, and especially since the headquarters are usually not involved directly in the communication, but only indirectly, it will be very, very difficult, a very big challenge for a negotiator to actually explain the model and persuade the Japanese members of Japanese headquarters to explain and persuade the Japanese headquarters to follow the abstract model and not focus on and not get lost in holistic thinking. So it's that is a major challenge, and I think that's a major obstruction point in developing Japanese businesses overseas.
The important for Japanese business, especially I think today, is they need to have more bigger longer time span picture. Instead of trying to succeed something immediately now, we need to have we need to have all the leaders to have Japanese mind as well as international mind.
Right.
And that's not up to global to understand Japanese culture. It's up to Japanese people to understand outside of Japan how they do business in this very international world today.
Right. Well, I mean that if there are outside companies who particularly wants to do business and take advantage of the strong points of the Japanese economy, then they need to learn Japanese business culture, of course. But it's very difficult, because it's really I would like to compare it as a difference between the religious beliefs of a Muslim versus a Christian. It's really a different world.
Yes. Yes. I'm studying about the Israel right now, and I think that I understand what you mean a little by that.
So yeah, that's why I wanted to show this video, induction, deduction, abduction, to kind of get a better understanding as to what are our core cultural values. This is the cultural value that we have. This is what we truly believe in as being right and wrong. This is what guides us to make decisions and to admit whether we're right and make compromises. If you can catch Westerners on fallacies in their reasoning or using wrong false premises, then you can easily win an argument. And if you're completely unaware of that and say, okay, well, and not engaging in this kind of model-like thinking, then you will lose most of your negotiating partners at the other side of the table, because basically we just don't understand that there is any other way of debate and negotiation than through the logical reasoning and deductive and inductive reasoning. So that is also a shortcoming that really exists at our side of the table. Our side meaning the side outside of Japan, because we believe that is what the world should be like. Okay, let's move on to the inductive.
What is abduction mean?
So induction is basically the same as deduction, but the premises are not 100% tested. They are based on experience. So the example that they use here is that because we have seen that from the past, aspirin has very often cured headaches. So I have a headache, therefore if I take this aspirin, it will most likely cure my headache. But it's not guaranteed, because it could be that the headache is not cannot be cured by the aspirin. The fact that aspirins can cure headaches doesn't necessarily cure my headache today. But based on my experience, I can deduct that if I have a headache, I take an aspirin, and I probably will be relieved of my headache.
Is it induction?
Induction.
How about abduction?
Abduction is more of a way of, I think he quoted Sherlock Holmes. So basically, what you do here, there was this example here about two guys eating. No, that was a better example was the
Sushi?
the sushi. Yeah. So basically, okay. What you could do, you can deduce the sushi example. So there are two guys in the same dorm room. They had sushi. Next morning they wake up and they both are sick. So you could deduct that they had bad sushi. They ate bad sushi. But abduction says, well, actually, we don't know enough to deduct that, because it could actually be that there is a virus going on in the dorm room. So there is a virus, and it's not the deduction that they go from eating the same thing. Therefore, it must be the sushi. We also need to learn more about the fact whether or not there was a virus going on in the dorm room. So this is the kind of like argumentation and reasoning that detectives, etc., and doctors use in order to test their hypothesis in order to find the truth. So this is what you see in Colombo and that kind of reasoning. So it's a constantly challenging the hypotheses until you reach a justifiable conclusion that would be persuasive enough for the judge to rule in your favor and make a decision, for example.
Say again?
So it's kind of
Sushi is what?
so the deduction would be
Okay.
two guys eat sushi,
Induction is
guys
you
get
said
sick.
aspirin.
The sushi must have been bad, so that's deduction. But abduction says, okay, well, we need to further test our hypotheses.
Other test.
Yeah, further test our hypotheses, because even though deduction says that is the most plausible experience, we do not know enough to actually deduct this information, because it could very well be that both guys were infected by a virus, and it was not because of the sushi, but it was because of the
Maybe
virus.
on another reason.
Right. So basically, if I would deduct these guys must have eaten bad sushi, then you would argue with me and say, well, no, wait a minute, we cannot conclude that it was the sushi. It could have very well been something else. It could have been because there was a virus. It could have been that actually, but we don't know where these guys were having the sushi, where the storeroom was. Maybe it was a terrible winter and it was extremely cold, and their stomach was
So
infected.
induction is inner analysis, abduction, outer analysis.
So abduction is furthermore capturing, basically taking out possible scenarios that
Outer analysis.
yeah.
Probable cause.
Yeah. Yeah, so to rule out other options and to further refine your hypothesis until it's falsified, and you need to change your hypothesis. The hypothesis is these guys ate bad sushi, right? So to go back to the beard example of Socrates. So his rival said, well, so the hypothesis was Socrates has a beard, because the premise was that number one, in ancient Greece most people had beards. Then the second premise was Socrates was a man, which is actually who lived in Athens, which we can almost say to be a truth. Then therefore the conclusion was, the hypothesis was, Socrates had a beard. Then the abductive argument was from then I would say, well, no, that's not true, because according to this philosopher, Socrates actually put hair on his face in order to feign that he had a beard, but actually he didn't have a beard. Then your argument would be, well, actually your counter-argument could be true, but we know for a fact that this guy had stake in the game, and he was trying to taint the reputation of Socrates. Therefore, it is very unlikely that this is to be true. We should fall back to our original premises, hypothesis, that Socrates had a beard. So very mendokusai. Very mendokusai as a way. But this is how negotiations and truth finding, etc., work.
Oh, negotiation, truth finding.
Right.
Oh. How about Socrates' method?
The Socratic method. So this is actually part of the Socratic method.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is part of the Socratic method.
This one, I don't know.
So
And Edison, about induction,
right.
induction method, we should have very, very carefully to use induction method because, for example, black swan theory.
Black
Swan. Usually, European people think swans are white,
yes.
perfectly white.
Right.
But in Australia, there was one black swan.
Right. Well, actually, we also have black swans so because of everything we saw so far. So you could actually argue that apples always fall down, therefore gravity exists.
Yes.
But if so far, up until today, apples always fall down, doesn't mean that an apple couldn't fall up tomorrow.
Yes.
So far, it's true, but the fact that we only observe
Yeah.
the fact that apples fall down doesn't prove exclusively
Yeah.
that apples will always fall down. It's just happens to be true so far. So it's through this induction we can conclude
Yeah.
through an inductive argument, but it's actually cannot be deductively defined.
Yes.
Another thing about the Socratic method is that it's not aimed to create winners and losers in a debate.
Debate.
Very often, other arguments, ego, will come into play,
Yeah.
and will people will let people identify with their argument, right? So, looking back at the series that we did about negotiation, one of the examples that comes to mind is France. France is very intellectual when it comes into debate, but they also have a very big pride. So you're very likely to encounter negotiators who take pride in their negotiation skills, and they very strongly focus and hold on to their own premises, and they don't want to be they don't want to lose the debate. But that's not the actual objective of the debate. Debate is aimed at truth finding.
Yes.
So win-win negotiators are very often true debaters, because they are not there to necessarily win. They are actually there to find the truth. So if you are in a win-win negotiation, you're actually into the true nature of debate, because you want to find the truth. You want to discover together what is the best solution for both sides. So this is, for us, it's kind of common sense. This is kind of like in our DNA, to think this way and to find and to kind of be smart and follow an argumentation and roll out your premises and try to persuade people based on these arguments. Then add other things, but kind of like getting influence and persuading others is a way that you can let yourself be felt as an individual, right? Western society is an individualistic society. I am the basis of everything. That means if I want to make myself known and gain influence, I need to be able to persuade others. And you do that through logical reasoning. Japanese society, that's the weapon of choice, basically. Reasoning, argumentation, logics. Then add all these rhetorical devices with it, body language and charisma and what have you, and you can become a bigger person as an individual. Japanese society is more focused into finding consensus, agreement. So therefore, there is much less space for debate. And much less an inclination towards argumentation and saying, well, but if you say that, then what about that? That means that since Japan is rather unique in this sense, they have a disadvantage, because they didn't grow up with this kind of like argumentation and this individualistic view of the world. Kids.
Why less debate Japanese are?
Because they are more looking for consensus. Looking for, working together. Not as an individual, but as a group. and
You mean
contributing.
compromise?
Compromising. The central identity is the group. Like in your example of your presentation, I remember the business card or the way that a Japanese businessman introduces himself, NEC no Tanaka. Right? If it was Philips, then it would be Janssen from Philips. So the person is first, then the company. So it's a person that enters a negotiation, not the company. But from Japanese side, the central entity is the company, and that you are just a representative of that company. But basically, you are there to represent the group, not yourself. So just to show how big the gap is, these kinds of like argumentation and intellectual. No, intellectual is not the right word, but a kind of like logical approach towards persuasion and to reaching conclusions is a game that is being played much more in Western society than in Japanese society.
But we cannot conclude the Japanese is making more consensus rather than debate. I think Japanese people need to consider more debate for coordination with European people. Otherwise, they feel very skeptical for Japanese people. Right?
Absolutely. I think that when you say there is no respect for Japanese people from Westerners, I think it's basically it's especially on moments like this when there is when the view of the reality from the Western side completely misses the view of the reality from the Eastern side, and therefore they think like, oh, what are these people talking about? We are not talking about these details yet, or we haven't even reached a conclusion about this, and you're already focusing on that. Well, let's first look at the entire elephant and then look at the parts. But that's not how Japanese traditional way of reasoning works. So that's when they feel like, oh, if you cannot follow the same steps of logics, then you must be dumb or not understanding what we're talking about here. Which is true, because basically there is a different view of the world. It's just that the Western side doesn't realize that their way of thinking is not necessarily the only way of thinking.
What we want to do to communicate with European people?
Become aware of this. Become aware of this, and understanding that if you want to build bridges, then you need to at least be on the same page. That you need to learn basically the viewpoint of the reality, the perception of reality of the counterpart. Otherwise, you cannot persuade them.
Right. Actually, we cannot persuade them.
I think Westerners hypothetical thinking, that's a very good method. For example, there's Westerners think hypothetical think there's if there is no Japan-U.S. alliance,
right?
We Japanese seldom think that. Therefore, if there's no Japan-U.S. alliance, Japanese people had very panic. But the Westerners think if there's no U.S.-Japan alliance, how to do it?
Right.
We should do it.
Right.
There's Westerners thinking.
Right.
For example, before the World War II, U.S. make a color code strategy. For example, orange code is for Japanese anti-Japanese strategy. U.S. make a United Kingdom strategy, anti-German strategy, US make many hypothetical thinking.
Right.
That's a very strong.
A blueprint.
Yeah, yeah.
Blueprint for action. That
Yeah,
in turns that goes that this kind of like
Yeah.
scenario comes into play.
Yes.
So at the moment when that happens, there is no time to think anymore. You need to execute and follow a plan, and not. One of the reasons why so many people lose money on the stock market, emotions.
Emotion.
Their strategy is not based on strategy that is decided prior to the things occurring. So a good stockbroker determines his strategy upfront and says, okay, when this happens, I will do that. When that happens, I will do that. And will follow meticulously on that strategy. But usually, people who invest in the stock market, when they're on a winning streak, they feel, well, I set out my goal to sell the stock at 150, but given that it's rising so fast and what I know right now, I want to hold on to that a bit longer because I feel that it's going to get higher up. That's when things go wrong. That's when things go wrong. That's when you lose a lot of money. That's where the amateur loses from the... That's why today we see that most of the professionals, they use mathematical models and automatically sell or buy at the same time. Unfortunately, everybody follows the same mathematical models. Therefore, we see so big fluctuations in the market because we are now all responding in the same way. That means that huge flows of money go from left to right and left to right. And the financial world is kind of amplifying the economic shocks. So economic shocks become much worse than they should have been. Than they should have been if people did not all follow the same strategy.
We Japanese should learn that type of hypothetical thinking.
Well, I can kind of understand that from a psychological point of view because it's not very nice to think about what happens. Oh, what happens if I get sick? Or that kind of like panic scenario. But you better think about it because it could happen. Right? So this negative approach. On the other hand, think about this example. The Japanese are the most over-insured people in the world.
Yes.
So that,
Japanese are the insurance.
so from that respect, I would say, well, they really take these scenarios into consideration. Otherwise, why would they buy so much insurance? So is there a difference between the individual and the country, or politicians and? What do you think makes that difference?
For Japanese, join the minimum insurance. That's to avoid the risks.
Right.
Just that's it.
To avoid the risk. Okay, so it's. But if Japan would also create the scenarios. For example, if the United States no longer supports Japan in a military way, then they would also kind of like buy insurance, right? But they don't, because they don't even want to think about it. So what's the difference between policy and the individual behavior? You know?
I know that.
Me neither. Me neither. So maybe there's just no answer. There's no insurance against it.
Japanese, you mean Japanese like insurance?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah. Oh, Japan is the wildest dream of every insurance company globally, because people buy insurance here like crazy.
Great.
You see, may I make a comment?
Yes. Oh, right. You have to comment because you work for an insurance company, right?
I did.
Oh.
I did. But it's not because of I work for insurance company, but it's just that the I think comes from the again individualism against organizationalism, and like it's let's see, the insurance is used for responsibility, right? Like you would buy extended warranty, for example,
Right.
so that when things break, you can ask for the repair for service.
Right.
And
Anshin.
Anshin, yes. And Anshin will be provided by the professional of that service.
Right.
I think that's the difference. In other countries, they also look for the cost performance.
Right.
But when you look at cost performance, when something screws up, who's going to be responsible for screwing up that job?
Right.
But in Japan, if you are allowing professionals to do it, then who's going to be responsible? Then the company is going to be responsible. Who's
Right.
providing that service?
Right.
So I think that's what makes the difference.
Yeah, sometimes it really doesn't make sense. Like I rented a car this week, and then you can buy extra insurance and extra insurance.
Yes.
But it's really like, okay, you're insuring the risk of having to pay goman yen for I don't know, almost 1,000 yen. Like, are you seriously that doesn't make any sense. Who gets that insurance? Almost everybody, apparently.
Yeah, just feel safety
Right.
and person who just don't want to pay that 500 yen. I mean 50,000 yen.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
It's and also if it's like travel for 1 or 2 days, I think people wouldn't care to pay that every for that number of days. But if you're renting for like 2 weeks, then I think some people will change their minds.
Right. It's psychological. Like, but this is also this is also so true. There's a game theory about this. Like, there's a game theoretic model about risk aversion and how much you are willing to pay. Like, purely mathematically speaking, it's people don't buy insurance, but actually because of this this emotional element of risk aversion, what if they are actually very eager to take that? It's the same with being in a like a television show where you can win a prize. So there is this How to Be a Millionaire or whatever. Going through the first questions is very simple. But you know that this game show that where I don't know exactly what the name is, but it's very popular everywhere in the world. You need to answer questions, and if you answer the question right, you can answer the question, and they double your price. But
I know.
If you answer it wrong,
or something like that.
Yeah, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire? Yeah, I think that's the name of the show. Yeah. So you if you answer it right, you can double your prize money. But if you answer it wrong, then you lose everything.
Yep.
So no, not everything. I think that's the point. You can keep that prize. So if you just stop, then you can keep the prize. If you give the wrong answer, you can lose everything.
Yeah.
So like almost everyone stops. Right, so because they feel like, oh, if I win $50,000, then that's a lot of money. So why would I risk play all or nothing for a question that I know for 90% sure? But if I would lose the $50,000, I could never forgive myself. So that's why people do not go for that extra step. It's human nature.
Oh, and by the way, when you mentioned about that the extra insurance, there's not only 50,000 coverage, but also it was for like the what do you call that? What do you call that?
Flat tire?
Yeah, flat tire.
Mm.
So I think just a matter, definitely emotional part. How often in Japan, when you're renting from a decent company, how often would you get a flat tire, right? I mean, but for a feel of unseen, feel of secureness, I think people, because it's only like 500 yen for the extra insurance per day.
Right. It's only 500 yen, so why not do it? But that's how they actually make the money, because the rental fee is not that high. But everybody buys insurance, dakara. They can still make money.
Yep.
Yeah. How about health insurance? Because I feel that health insurance is also, people are also insuring themselves quite.
Yes. With I'm not really familiar with life insurance, but I know that there's cancer insurance is popular.
Right. That surprises me, because like only insurance for cancer, but there could be all kinds of other diseases that you could attract. Because in the Netherlands, it's illegal to sell insurance that only has a certain kind of disease. So yeah,
many Japanese like only cancer disease.
right. But you could get Alzheimer, you could get, and it will make your life just as miserable. But you only have insurance for cancer. Yeah, that's too bad.
You see, and then speaking of the insurance, these recent disasters we're having in Japan,
right?
I think that would help increase the natural disaster insurance for the cars, for example.
Right.
Because Kyushu wasn't expected for earthquake or whatnot before, and now we have it, and it's I think more opportunity for insurance markets in soon future.
Right. Yeah, so that's basically where people's fears and emotions really come into play and become a big market.
Mm-hmm.
So, but yeah, that's actually. But if it's, I don't know whether it's typical Japanese or not. What is your feeling? I just happen to know that maybe they just have enough money and they're risk averse enough to do that, but. I cannot really understand it as a phenomenon of Japanese culture, actually.
Well, I don't know if I can represent the answer, but from way I feel, or maybe because I'm just being persuaded, but it's just some in this renting car case, for example. That means you are there for vacation. And
sorry, can you repeat that? I didn't hear that.
Okay. I don't know if I will be able to represent the answer as Japanese, but at least from my personal opinion, from my impressions, when I go rent a car out and when they offer me insurance and double insurance, I also would often get it. And one of my reasons is you are renting a car for vacation.
Right.
And they are I think in Japan for car insurance, one is lots of people are beginner drivers.
Yeah.
Right?
I think 90% of the cars on the road are beginner drivers.
And then it is beginner drivers and having some good having insurance covered makes you feel comfortable, right?
Right.
I won't be calling myself beginner driver as those people. I don't own a car, but I've been driving in the States and I've been driving many times in Japan when I rent a car. But still, I go for it in my case because I just feel of safety. But just what it means is I guess don't want to regret when actually the thing happens.
Right.
Yeah, you don't had a choice of able to be covered with this for cheap, for cheap insurance.
Can I ask you a question? So
Sure.
you don't want to regret. Is that if you would rent a car and then you would not get the insurance and an accident would happen, would you regret it for yourself, or would other people criticize you for not getting insurance?
No, I'll be pissed at myself.
Okay.
Why would I'm paying this much money for this, and I could have been covered.
Right. Okay. I see. But I think that everybody has that. But on the other hand, do you feel relieved when you do not get the insurance and you think, oh, you got that? I didn't get the insurance, so I got a good deal on this car.
Yeah, but I would have defined that as lucky.
Right.
Because if you want to apply that argument, then why do you want to cover yourself to start with? You don't even need a liability.
Right. Well, but basically there is this. Okay, the worst case. So, for example, I went to the Netherlands for a month or 2 months, and I was offered health insurance, and I thought, damn, that's expensive.
Mm-hmm.
So I thought, well, you know what? I'm not going to take it. So I didn't get the health insurance, and luckily I didn't get sick. And I felt, oh, well, fortunately I didn't get health insurance, but I also felt, oh, a bit lucky. But that is just okay. So if I would have to go to the hospital, that's my own fault. That's stupid. But it's a risk that I took. I took the wrong gamble. Okay, I just need to pay it.
Right.
Right.
With health insurance, I don't know. I'm still not even covered with the one with health insurance, but with the car insurance, this is something with your car record. This is something with the when you cause a wreck, then you're also interrupting others.
Right.
And that, I think with car insurance, I think also with the feel of guilt of maybe you'll be really interrupting someone's life.
Right. But that's a different kind of insurance, right?
Right. I mean, well, car insurance. I mean, yeah, but when you create a dent, then when you make a car accident.
Yeah.
And when someone's in that car, and if you are the cause of the accident.
Yeah.
Then you have to pay for the car you rented. You have to pay for the car the damage of others. You have to pay the money for their hospital.
Right. So.
And if you are covered, then you're pretty much in a good expensive zone for dealing with all of it, right?
Yeah, but I think if you rent a car, then your liability is covered, right?
Liability is covered yes, liability is covered. So I think another part is, if you... No. You have option to cover your liability.
Oh, really? That's impossible in the Netherlands. You need to cover your liability.
No, Japanese case is mandatory.
Mandatory.
Yeah, mandatory portion. But you should also pay for additional insurance coverage. Otherwise, you cannot pay them all.
Right.
In the case of injury. So Japanese car insurance, everybody join for this car insurance, right? But health insurance overseas, depending on people.
Right.
1 month or 2 months or a couple of weeks. This is depending on people. Not all of those. I think a few people pay for overseas health insurance.
Right.
But car insurance, almost everybody pay for that. Right?
Well, especially liability, because actually the risk of actually if not getting liability insurance and causing an accident that could actually wreck you entirely. The chances that it happens are slim, but if it happens...
Also, do you know the health overseas insurance valued by insurance company? Big values.
Yeah.
I just asked for the overseas insurance inside after custom I just tried to ask for the insurance, but very
So
expensive.
if you go to the Netherlands, then you would buy insurance in the Netherlands, not in Japan.
No. Outside custom or inside custom, price is big difference. Inside the custom, very expensive. Outside custom is more cheaper.
So what do you mean by custom there?
Custom clearance. Custom clearance.
Custom clearance.
Yes.
So once you enter the country.
Yes, if you go outside the custom clearance, insurance, overseas health insurance is cheap. Whenever you get inside the custom clearance, insurance charges get now increased more than 30%. On the way to gate, you can find several terminals, right? That place is very expensive. If you want to join the insurance payment, you have better before checking in. This is different. I didn't recognize. Last time I paid a lot of money. Ridiculous.
So local insurance is better deal.
Very what?
Local insurance, that's destination,
Local insurance.
is better deal.
Better deal, you mean cheap, right?
Cheap.
Okay. So what's going on? I wake up.
You wake up.
So we talked about deductive reasoning. So Uno-san,
Huh? By the way, your voice is sounding. How come? Hounding.
counting.
Yeah, big hounding. There.
He lives in a huge house, Dakara. It sounds very hollow.
Right?
Yeah,
Really?
it echoes.
Echoes, yeah.
Yeah. Huge echo.
Sorry.
He lives
What?
his house is too big.
Really? Your microphone.
It's not big.
Why so hounding?
No furniture.
Well, it's just how this room is designed. So I want to mention, the deductive reasoning is using the knowledge and information you have in order to understand or form an opinion
Right.
about something. Inductive is using known facts.
The other way around, deductive.
No. Deductive is using the knowledge and information you have.
What's he say?
Yeah, so deduction is the premises are facts, known facts.
Premise is known facts.
Yeah. So,
Okay.
so for example, Socrates was a man. Socrates lived in Athens. Those are facts.
Yes.
Then inductive becomes when most men in Athens had beards. So deduction would say probably Socrates had a beard. That is deduction. But it becomes of induction. That becomes induction, right? But if I would say Socrates is a man, that is a fact.
Yes.
All men are mortal, that's a fact. I can deduce, therefore, Socrates is mortal, is a deduction.
Yeah. Okay. So excellent. So the deductive is we use the phrase therefore, right?
Therefore, yes, exactly.
Yes.
Therefore, yes.
In inductive, we use the phrase should be.
Exactly. So probably.
Probably. So there's probability.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So therefore and probably. Okay.
Yeah.
And now we're going to the third one, right?
Yeah. So abduction.
Abduction.
So abduction is basically trying to falsify your deduction.
Falsify deduction.
Right.
Okay.
So basically, deduction is a probability, but if you want to strengthen the probability, is you're trying to falsify your conclusion based on your deduction. That is the most logical outcome.
Wait. You said inductive was probably.
Yeah, induction is probably.
Well, you just now say that deduction is probability.
Oh, sorry. No, then I if I said that, then I said it wrong because you're going to falsify your induction. Because if it is deducted, then there is no way in falsifying it because it's a truth.
Okay.
Yeah. So inductive conclusion is the most likely outcome. So two guys eating sushi, both get sick. Probably had bad sushi.
Yes.
So that is a deduction. That's the most likely occurrence. But you want to strengthen that conclusion by abduction. That is saying, okay, well, we cannot conclude that because there may have been a virus going on in the campus. So that is a counter argument that would falsify the conclusion of your deduction of a induction. Sorry, induction. So that is so use this process of abduction to come to a conclusion that is that can prove as a proof. So a police officer, a detective, not like a for crime investigation, for example, always needs to use abduction to make sure that the conclusion of their deduction holds up in court. That means it needs that you need to abduct that and you need to falsify alternative possibilities that would falsify your deduction, the conclusion of your deduction.
Okay.
Right.
Okay.
Right. So that is and until proven guilty means that you need to build a very solid case. Otherwise, you are innocent until proven guilty. That makes the need for abduction extremely extremely necessary, and this is why we have so many lawyers in the United States and not so many in Japan.
Okay.
All right, let's continue. So the point here, more or less, is basically this kind of like a game of induction, deduction, abduction is a way to substantiate and come to a conclusion. Very often different from Japanese culture.
Okay.
I'm sorry, but I forgot what the relevance of Cartesian skepticism was, and what we needed. So, going back to induction and deduction. Descartes was looking for the core fundamental thing of what is real, what exists, and therefore he concluded that there is no such thing as an empirical truth, because the reality is relative and it cannot be objectively be established. The beliefs are not real. So ultimately, he was doubting everything, and then he realized, oh, wait a minute, I doubt, therefore I think. My doubts are real, so I think, therefore I am. So that is the basic deduction of the foundational stone on which he built his reality. So he broke down the entire world. The most essential thing that, okay, the only thing that he could actually really prove that was 100% true was that he existed, because he was thinking, therefore he existed. And from there on, he could build rebuild his view of the world again. So
What does apple mean?
Apple. So basically, if you put if you have a basket with apples, right, you want to be sure that there is no rotten apple inside the basket, because one rotten apple will infect everything. So basically, if you want to be sure that the apples will not rot, you need to make sure that the apples are all real. So basically, in order to find the bad apple, you cannot take a sample, one or two. You really need to get rid of all the apples and examine them one by one to know exactly what is true. So he was looking for the rotten apple and then start to drill down to the essence. So he started with a complete empty basket. He'll say, okay, what do I know for a fact? What can I really deduct about the reality? What is anything real? Is anything that exists? Does anything exist, or is everything a figment of my imagination?
Mm.
So, well, it started to rain.
Started to rain?
Kom on.
How do you know?
I hear it.
You see it? Heavy rain?
Heavy rain. Sugar. Deduction. Deduction was only possible when he realized that he was having thoughts, and therefore he knew that he existed, and that was the basis on which he could build the rest of the world. That is typical for philosophy in Western world compared to Confucianism, that doesn't ask these kinds of questions, but it shows more of a road. Just follow these steps, and you will reach a stage of enlightenment, of becoming a true gentleman. Doesn't ask the essential questions, the existentialist questions. It provides guidance to people how to live a good life. It's an ethical element, more in line with not Socrates, but Aristotle. But these kind of questions, they are completely different from and actually more in line with Zen Buddhism.
Confucianism, they have no question.
Right.
Decisive everything.
Right.
Sun Tzu is also decisive.
Right.
Why?
So it's a different foundation in philosophy. They are. It's like a Bible, right? Bible doesn't really have questions either. It's just a guideline that this is how you should live. Just follow the Bible.
No question?
No question.
How Aristotle and all those era, what kind of method they try to write down on the plate?
Socratic.
On the plate?
How to? You mean on the plate?
Yeah. What kind of material?
So the rolls, ne?
Plank?
I think no. Actually, they used rolls.
Stone?
These papyrus. No, that's for longer ago. But
they don't have the paper yet. 2,500 years ago, they don't have.
2,500 years ago, they had paper.
No.
No?
No.
I think they used papyrus, no?
No. This is written down on the slate or some stone.
No, that's almost impossible because he wrote many books.
Stone.
Invention of paper. Let's Google it.
China is bamboo.